Now, we've been focusing on a lot of the problems with sexuality today. We're going to look at some of the positive side of sexuality, what God had in mind when He made us as sexual beings. And I'm really pleased to have a lot of our Empower people with us today. If you work with Empower, will you please stand up? Oh, there's more of you than that. Ken and Lovey, where are you? Okay, yes. So if you are interested in what we're doing, please talk with one of these people afterwards. We work with Christian leaders, and our methods are such that we lead people to take the Bible, understand it in your own context, and then make applications for your own culture. And we find that there are many understandings of how we should live together that can be found in the Scriptures when we read it with an unbiased eye. Okay. So we start with Jesus in Matthew 19. Sorry, I have to move around. Matthew 19 tells of a time when the Pharisees, when Jewish teachers came to Jesus, and they want to get him involved in an argument that they're having about the grounds on which a man can chase away his wife. And Jesus will not talk to them about divorce. Instead, he says, haven't you read that he who made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and will hold fast to his wife, and they two will become one flesh. What God has joined together, let not man separate. Well, the Pharisees are outraged, or maybe they think they've caught Jesus in a trap here, because they say, but Moses let us divorce our wives. And Jesus said, Moses let you chase away your wives because your hearts were hard. But in the beginning, it wasn't so. So Jesus is sending us back to creation to see what God had in mind when He made us as man and woman. And the first thing He quotes is Genesis 1. God created humankind as male and female in God's image. So if we go back to Genesis 1, we see God creating the heavens and the earth and separating the light from the darkness, the water from the dry land. And after each day of creation, what does He say? It is good. And then on the sixth day, He creates humankind. He creates Ubuntu. What is it in Swahili? Ubuntu. And He makes humankind as male and female. And He blesses them both with dominion over the whole earth, and the blessings of children, the woman as well as the man. And He blesses them with every good thing for food, and with dominion over the fowls of the air and the fish of the sea. And then He says, it is very good. So it is only when we are there as man and woman, in God's image as man and woman, that we have dominion over the earth, that creation is complete, and it is very good. So this man and woman, that causes so much problems in the world, is the crowning act of creation. When God made us, He made it to be a source of joy, a source of our power in the world. Because it's only when we are there as man and woman together that we have dominion over the earth. Now, when we teach this material, people work through these studies. you all got copies of these. And so bring it tomorrow. I'm going to be talking about Genesis 3 tomorrow. When we work through the studies, people come back and they report their surprises in their applications. So in 2008, I taught this with the Anglican Archdiocese in Burundi. And afterwards, the Archbishop got up and he said, what are the implications of Genesis 1 for legislation that is pending in Parliament that will allow women to inherit property? Very profound cultural applications. It's in the Bible. What are the implications of woman being given dominion over the earth when we're looking at laws that say whether she should be able to inherit a patch of ground from her father or her husband? And we've also had people come back saying women can eat chicken. Yes. And in fact, my son David Wanyoni, who translated our study guide into Kiswahili, says what he learned from this is my wife eats what I eat when I eat it. This is what Jesus sends us back to, very practical cultural applications. The next thing that Jesus said, and for this reason a man will leave his father and his mother, now think about the cultural implications of that one, and will hold fast to his wife, and they two will become one flesh. That's Genesis 2. So in Genesis 2 we see, we're being told another version of creation. And this time, this is very typical of Hebrew literature, that they will tell the same story, but in a slightly different way. And the differences tell us something. They answer a question. And in this case, Genesis 2 answers the question of why God made us as sexual beings. And it tells us that God had planted the beautiful Garden of Eden, but he hadn't made it rain yet because there wasn't anyone to tend and keep the garden. So he decides to make the umuntu, the human being. And he makes it out of the dust of the earth, this umuntu, this human being, and he breathes life into it, and it becomes a living soul. Well, the word in Hebrew for what God created is ha-adam, and it is a play on the Hebrew word for the red earth, which is Adamah. And so God makes this creature out of the earth and calls it the earth creature, right? Or the thing that God created from the earth. And then God immediately says, and this is telling us why God has made us as male and female, it isn't good that the earth creature should be alone. He says, I will make him a help suitable or suitable for him, a help fitting for him. Now, many people who we work with come to the seminars knowing that when God made woman, he made her as the housemaid. Right? Only good enough to produce children and to cook and to make the bed. But the words that God used for what the earth creature needed is not a housemaid. In fact, the first word, the word that's translated help, is used 21 times in the Old Testament, and 17 or 18 of those times it refers to God. God as our help. I lift mine eyes to the hills, whence comes my help? My help is the Lord. It is a strong help that the earth creature needs. He doesn't need a housemaid. He needs a strong help. But the next word that God uses, the one that's translated suitable or fitting or as a partner, puts this help in perspective. I used to talk about it being suitable or fitting as a partner. I have an Israeli friend that I was telling about this. He speaks Hebrew, right? And he said, that word doesn't mean suitable. He said, that word means facing. And I said, even better. What the earth creature needs is not a low helper. He doesn't need a high helper. He doesn't need another God. He needs a helper face to face. Face to face on the same level. Now think about the cultural implications of that in cultures where the woman cannot look the man in the face. You can't look each other in the eye. And you're embarrassed to have that kind of relationship with your wife. So this is what God said was the ideal relationship between man and woman. This is what Jesus says is the ideal relationship between man and woman. And we will see later that this is what Paul says is the ideal relationship between man and woman. For this reason, a man leaves his father and mother and holds fast to his wife, and they two become one flesh. And now I'm sorry I threw away the stand, because what God does is he takes one lonely creature and he divides it in two. And in such a way that they long to come back together as one. They long to come back together as one. And so God puts the earth creature into a sleep, and he takes not a little rib. I think the Kurundi Bible brings this well, maybe some of the other ones. Because in Hebrew it's not just a little bone that gets squeezed, it's a big part of the earth creature. Maybe he even divides the earth creature in two, I don't know. But he takes part of the earth creature and he makes it into a woman, and he brings this woman to the man, and for the first time we have the Hebrew word for man, and he says, this one at last, this one at last, this one is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. She will be called woman, because she was taken from the man. And so he is now a man for the first time. There was not, the word for man was not used before there was the woman there. So now they're both, man and woman are again created at the same time. And woman is made not to create complete man, my rector in Virginia used to say, but to complete the image of God. And now together they're the image of God. And the next verse in Genesis 2 says, and the man and his wife were naked, and they were without shame. Think what it means to have a relationship in which you are naked and without shame. Where you can be honest and fearless with one another. You can hold fast to one another. This is what God created us for. Amen? Amen. It's a beautiful thing, isn't it? Yes. So Mrs. Margaret Kiswawiri, who is the president of Empower Uganda, says when she teaches us about, and she tells this beautiful story, people always say, what happened? What happened? If this is what God made us for, how did it get to be so hard? How did it get to be so hard to be one flesh with another human being? And so the Bible takes us now to Genesis 3 and the introduction of sin into the world. And the big surprise in this study is that the man was not cursed. The woman was not cursed in Genesis 3 after they fall. I'm going to talk about this tomorrow, so you'll have to take my word for it for now. But bring your books tomorrow when we do I think it's at 9:30. It says you can't curse what God has blessed. But woman wasn't cursed, and in fact we see that if we read the text carefully, that the husband, the man, was there while the woman was being tempted by the serpent. He was standing there the whole time and doesn't say anything. So the woman isn't cursed, the man isn't cursed, but the ground is cursed, and the serpent is cursed. Do you understand what I'm saying? How do you say cursed, Frank? Cursed? I'm trying to talk like a machiga. The ground is cursed, and the things that happen to the people now, the rupture of their relationships, are consequences of them having to live outside of God's abundance because they have chosen to go their own way. And now, instead of the beautiful labor that we were made for, of tending and keeping the beautiful garden, we have Itzadon is the word in Hebrew, and it means sorrow. We eat our bread in sorrow. We bring forth children in sorrow, in painful, hard labor, because we have no faith. We lose that joy in our work. And the men become separated from the woman. Now, when I taught the seminar, well, we didn't have the seminar yet. It was in 2007, and Margaret Kiswe was translating for me. We were in southwestern Uganda, and we had a group of women leaders. We were in a big building that had a metal roof. And I asked the ladies, when a man pays dowry price, what is he buying? What's the word for dowry price in Kenya? Do you use the same term?
Yes.
Okay. Mahari, okay. So when a man pays dowry price in the fallen world, what is he buying? And they said, children. So I wrote that down. And they said food or labor. So I wrote that down. And then it started to rain on this metal roof. And it's very loud. And the ladies, we're standing on a platform and the ladies are a little far away. And they are yelling something. I cannot hear them. So finally Margaret goes down and she comes back and she says, sex, they're saying sex. So I write that down. And then they start yelling again. Well, it's raining even harder. And so Margaret goes down and she comes back and she says, they say, no, put that on top. Okay, so in the fallen world, after the fall, this is all the man wants from the woman. He doesn't want friendship. He doesn't want companionship. If he has a problem, does he go to his wife? No, he goes to his brother, his uncle, not to his wife. There's no intimacy in the fallen world. And this is true in many places than just Africa. We all have the same problem, we just wear different clothes. And for the men, we've talked about some of the problems that men have today, and we've talked about patriarchy. And often people think that patriarchy is men oppressing women. But patriarchy, for most of human history, most men have been oppressed too. Patriarchy is actually a few people on top, oppressing everyone else, male and female. And so the men are caught up, and this is what God says to them after they fall. He says, you want to live in this world where you make your own decisions, where you have the knowledge of good and evil, where you think you're going to be like God. And the men are going to have this constant struggle with other men to eat. So this is what happens. And this is, we're all fallen like this. We all have the same tendencies in our hearts that the first man and woman did. We want to be gods ourselves. We want to make the rules ourselves and to have the knowledge of good and evil. So for most of life, of human life, when times got hard, people would sell family land in order to get what to eat. And sometimes they would sell the children in order to survive. Sometimes people would sell themselves into slavery in order to get enough to eat. In the Old Testament law provided a role called a redeemer. And you see this if you read a book of Ruth, the Redeemer. And the Redeemer was a near family member, and the Redeemer had the right to buy back the family land. And the person who had bought it had to sell to the Redeemer, and they would restore it to the clan. Because God would not let the families be broken. He would not let the family lands be taken away forever. And the Redeemer could buy back the children and restore them to the family. So God has given us a Redeemer who buys us back from this sin that we've fallen, sold ourselves into sin of the fallen world. And so he sent us Jesus to be a Redeemer and to bring us back to that garden relationship. Because, I usually write, I don't have a place to write. This is a three-part story. This is the Christian story of creation ideal, fall, and redemption. So Jesus comes to restore us to the garden, to restore us to the relationship of one flesh with each other, a world where our hearts are not hard, and to restore us to what we were created for, the joyful labor of the garden rather than the sorrowful hard work of the world. And Jesus, that's okay. I don't think there's a pen. Is there? Okay. Well, will you write creation ideal, fall, and redemption for me? And Jesus redeems us not just by his death on the cross. Can you erase that? No. We should leave it. It's needed. Oh, okay. We'll just write it here. Creation ideal.
Ideal.
Mm-hmm. Fall.
Fall.
And redemption. Okay, thank you. So this is just the Christian story, right? So man and woman in our relationship is very tightly bound up in this. So Jesus comes to redeem us and to take us back to here. And we don't need to live in this world anymore where the hearts were hard and we're fighting against each other. And Jesus redeems us not just by his death on the cross, but by every word out of his mouth. Everything he teaches, he's bringing us back. So when we know children are good for, women are good for nothing but children, labor, and sex. Right? What does Jesus say about that? Well, there's an incident in the book of Luke where Jesus is out preaching in the crowd, and a woman in the crowd sees him and she wants to say something wonderful to him. And she calls out, "Blessed is the womb that bore you and the breasts that nursed you." Okay? So she sees the value of a woman just in childbearing. Right? And Jesus' mother is blessed, is happy because she had such a wonderful son. What does Jesus say? You guys are good. You are a Bible expert. Jesus says, "No, blessed rather is the one who hears the word of God and obeys it." Now think about Jesus' mother. She's a young virgin. An angel comes, says, "You're going to have a baby." She says, "But I don't have a husband." What happens in traditional African cultures when a girl got pregnant without a husband? I'm sorry, I can't hear what you're saying. What happens?
You lose value.
You lose value. In southern Uganda, you lost more than value. What did you lose in southern Uganda? This is our African program director, by the way.
Some of them would be put on an island in a lake called Lake Bunyonyi, isolated to die there, and others would be thrown over a cliff, waterfall, and they die.
So the girls who got pregnant without a husband were killed. And the Jews did that too. In Deuteronomy, it says if a girl On her wedding night is found not to be a virgin. They said, let the man of the town come and stone her to death. So this angel comes to Jesus' mother and says, you're going to have a baby without a husband. And she says, be it unto me according to your word. She heard the word of the Lord. She obeyed it. It is that is important about women. That they are restored to that relationship with God. That they are whole people in relation to God. And similarly, we have the story of Mary and Martha, where Jesus comes to visit these two sisters, and Martha is running around preparing all the food, and Mary is sitting at Jesus' feet. This is an expression that meant she was a disciple of Jesus. Women didn't do this. This was not women's work. Women were supposed to be fixing the food. Women were supposed to be doing the labor. And so Martha comes to Jesus and says, don't you care that I'm doing all the work? My sister's acting like a man. Tell her to help me. And Jesus says, what does Jesus say? Mary has chosen the better part. Now, he doesn't disrespect Martha. He says, I know you're worried about all these things. You're having a lot of itzavon. You're having a lot of painful toil. But Mary has chosen the better part, and it's not going to be taken away from her. So women can learn. Women need to be given time to sit at Jesus' feet. Women are more than just the housemaid. And I don't have time to talk to you about Jesus and women as men's sexual property. But Jesus repeatedly refuses to let this idea that a woman belonged to a man sexually and no one else should even see her or speak to her. He always is reaching out to women, bringing them into discipleship, and sending them out to serve. So Jesus defies the things that that women have been put into as a result of the fall, and instead raises them back up to their position with God. Now, often we see men are feared when we start talking about raising up women, because too many times in a worldly way, people raise up women by putting down men, by taking things away from men. Okay, good. So now I'm being harassed. But Jesus raises up men too, and restores them to their position with God. So we don't have to be worried about raising up women in a Christian way, in a earthly way, because God will raise up the men too. And we see Jesus spends so much time teaching men that they no longer have to be part of the system where men oppress other men. He tells us that the big man is really a little boy in God's kingdom, and that we don't need to be always pushing ourselves forward. And I'm just going to tell one story to illustrate that. And this is the Last Supper, where Jesus and his disciples have gathered in the upper room to eat the Passover meal. And there is no one there to wash feet. Okay? Now, people in Jerusalem, they wore open sandals, and their feet would get very dirty. And I'm not going to lie down on the table, but if Pastor Frank were giving this, he would lie down here on the table. They would lie down to eat. They recline while they ate, so their dirty feet were up in people's faces. So people would have a slave at the door who would wash your feet when you came in. Well, there's no one there to wash feet. So John tells us in this story that they come into this room and Jesus knows that the Father has put all power and authority in the whole earth into his hands. Jesus knows he's been given the rulership of the whole world. And the next thing he does is take off his robe and put a towel around his waist. This was the sign of a slave, to be girded with a towel. And he starts washing his disciples' feet. So Jesus changes the definition of what it means to be a male human being. And it's not that we all have to go around washing the dishes now or washing each other's feet. But he changes the definition from wanting to be the big man and feeling bad when you're not the big man, wanting to be the one who is served, to being the one who serves. So the man, the redeemed man, the man who is back up in creation ideal, does not seek to be served, but to serve others. And Jesus served us with the cost of his own life. He submitted in all ways. And so redefined what it meant to be a man in that kind of culture. And we serve others by lifting each other up, by empowering the powerless, by helping each other be glorious, and restoring us to a relationship where we can all be one again in the Christian community. And this kind of power is infinite. There is no end to the kind of power that Jesus tells the Christian man to grow into the world. So we see this image of being restored up here to the Christian ideal, and then Jesus says that the ideal then is being one flesh, clinging to each other, and being restored to that face-to-face relationship. And finally, in my last 2 minutes, I will talk briefly about Paul and Ephesians 5 and 6, and we've had some questions about that already. You usually hear Ephesians 5:22, wives, be subject to your husbands as unto the Lord. Okay? Now, if we look carefully at that, as we do in our studies, we see that if you look in the Greek, that's not a sentence. There's no verb. It just says, wives to your husbands. So if we want to know what Paul's talking about, we can't just quote that. We have to look up further. The letter to the Ephesians is Paul writing to this group of people. They were Gentiles. They were outside the Jewish community, and now they've become Christ followers. And Paul is writing to them about this great mystery of us all being brought into the family, brought into God's family and adopted as sons. And the women are adopted as sons, and they will inherit as sons. So Ephesians is about how we stop being subject to the big men, we stop honoring the big man or making our social world revolve around them, and we make God the big man in our lives, and we honor him, we repay him for his provision for us, because now we're back in the garden, and God is taking care of us, providing everything, we're living by faith. We honor God by how we treat each other. And we treat each other the way God is treating us, with agape love, God's love, self-sacrificing love. So if we're going to read verse 5:22, we need to go up to at least 20. And Paul says, always and for everything, give thanks in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ to God the Father, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. We submit to one another. Wives, to your own husbands. And he goes on to tell the husbands how they submit to their wives by agape, loving them as their own body. And he's the head, which doesn't mean boss, but it means the one who creates unity. And he's the head, she's the body, and he loves her as he loves his own body, and he makes her glorious as he makes his own body, and he sacrifices for her the way he sacrifices for his own body. And Paul says, for this reason a man leaves his father and mother and holds fast to his wife, and they two become one flesh. So Paul brings it home. And he goes on to talk about the relationship between parents and children, and the fathers now serve their children. And he talks about the relationship between masters and helpers, or slaves, and most of the world that Paul was writing to were slaves. And tells them, the master, that God doesn't see any difference between the masters and the slaves. So that this is the whole Christian household, the whole Christian community is submitting to one another in imitation of Christ, who submitted for us in all things, even to death on the cross. Because submission means to put yourself under in a strong way in order to lift others up. We're restored. Amen. Okay.